Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't fighting for what's right. It's knowing when to walk away from what's wrong. Every man reaches a moment where his conscience collides with his survival. And for mountain man Samuel Creek, that moment comes when he finds a young Mexican woman named Elena chained to a desert rock, left to die by Sheriff Morrison for crossing the border. Creek has spent 15 years avoiding people and their problems, but Elena's desperate eyes remind him of everything he's tried to forget about being human. The sheriff claims she's a criminal who deserves her fate, but Creek sees something different, an innocent woman paying the price for other men's hatred. Saving her means becoming an outlaw himself and making enemies of every lawman in the territory. Elena carries secrets that could destroy the corrupt sheriff, but first they have to survive the desert, the law, and the dangerous men hunting them both. Will one man's awakened conscience be enough to stand against a system built on cruelty? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain that Samuel Creek had called home for the better part of 15 years. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he skinned the rabbit he'd caught in his snares, the blade glinting in the early light. At 52, Creek carried the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to find peace in solitude. Though the lines around his grey eyes spoke of battles, fought long before he'd retreated to these mountains, his cabin sat tucked into a natural alcove of red stone, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The structure itself was modest, rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that rarely smoked except on the coldest winter nights. Inside, his few possessions were arranged with military precision: a bedroll, cooking gear, and a worn leather journal filled with 15 years of observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the slow changing of seasons. The journal's pages also held careful sketches of the landscape he'd grown to love, detailed drawings that revealed an artist's eye hidden beneath the mountain man's gruff exterior. Creek had chosen this isolation deliberately after the war ended and took everything that mattered to him. The memories of Gettysburg and Antietam, of friends who'd never made it home, of a young wife and infant daughter lost to fever while he was fighting for causes that seemed less clear with each passing year. All of it had driven him deeper into the wilderness where the only enemies were weather and hunger. Challenges a man could face honestly, but peace, he'd learned, was a fragile thing. 40 miles south, in the border town of Copper Wells, Sheriff Morrison adjusted his silver badge and surveyed his domain from the porch of his office. Morrison was a man of average height, but imposing presence, with cold blue eyes and prematurely grey hair that lent him an air of authority he'd never truly earned. He ruled his territory through fear and selective justice, turning a blind eye to crimes that profited him while coming down hard on anyone who threatened his control. The Mexican families who crossed into his jurisdiction seeking work or fleeing violence quickly learned that Morrison's law came with a price. Those who could pay his unofficial taxes were allowed to stay and work the mines and ranches. Those who couldn't or wouldn't faced imprisonment, violence, or worse. Morrison had built a profitable network of corruption that stretched from local mine owners to territorial officials, all of them benefiting from cheap labor and selective law enforcement. Elena Vasquez had learned about Morrison's brand of justice the hard way. At 19, she possessed the kind of fierce determination that her mother had passed down through generations of women who'd survived hardship through sheer will. Her dark eyes held depths of sorrow that seemed too mature for her years, and her calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of hard work. She'd crossed the border 3 weeks ago with her 15-year-old brother Miguel, fleeing the violence that had consumed their village in Sonora. The journey north had been treacherous, days of walking through desert heat with little water, nights huddled together against the cold, always watching for bandits, wild animals, or the American law enforcement that treated border crossers as criminals regardless of their circumstances. Miguel had been sick when they started the journey, weakened by months of poor food and the stress of watching their world collapse around them. Elena had carried him when he couldn't walk, shared her meager water when his fever spiked, and whispered stories of the better life waiting for them in America. They'd made it to within 5 miles of copper. Wells, when Morrison's deputies found them, Elena would never forget the sound of hoofbeats approaching their small camp at dawn, or the way Miguel had tried to stand protectively in front of her despite his weakness. Deputy Barnes, a cruel man who enjoyed his work too much, had laughed at the boy's defiance before striking him down with the butt of his rifle. Miguel's head had struck a rock with a sound that still echoed in Elena's dreams. "Border jumpers," Morrison had announced when his men brought Elena to his office. Miguel's body, already beginning to stiffen in the wagon behind them, set an example for the others. Elena had begged, pleaded, offered to work for free, promised to return to Mexico immediately. Morrison had listened with the patient expression of a man who'd heard it all before, then nodded to his deputies. They dragged her 3 miles into the desert, chained her to a boulder with iron shackles that had been used for the same purpose before, and left her with a single cup of water. "Maybe the buzzards will have more mercy than I do," Morrison had said, his voice carrying no emotion at all. That had been 2 days ago. Creek first heard the rattling of chains on his second day of tracking a wounded elk through the lower canyons. The sound was out of place, metal against stone, in a landscape where such things didn't belong. His military instincts, dulled by years of peace but never completely dormant, sharpened his attention. Something was wrong. He found her just after noon, when the sun was at its most merciless. The young woman was conscious, but barely, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst, her dark hair matted with sweat and dust. The iron shackles around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw, and Creek could see that she'd been pulling against them despite the pain, refusing to accept her fate quietly. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Even in her extremity, they blazed with defiance and intelligence. They reminded him of Sarah, his wife, who'd faced her own death with the same fierce courage. For a moment, Creek felt the familiar weight of grief settle over his shoulders, followed quickly by something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the urgent need to act, to save someone while he still could. "Easy now," he said softly, kneeling beside her and offering water from his canteen. "Easy?" Elena's first instinct was suspicion. In her experience, American men who found vulnerable Mexican women alone rarely had honorable intentions. But Creek's weathered face held only concern, and when she tried to speak and managed only a croak, he simply helped her drink without demanding explanations or payment. "Who did this to you?" Creek asked, once she'd had enough water to speak. "Sheriff Morrison," Elena whispered, her voice raw but steady. "He killed my brother for crossing the border. Left me here to die as a warning to others." Creek studied the heavy iron shackles, noting their design and construction. He'd seen similar restraints used on military prisoners during the war, though never for anything as simple as crossing an invisible line in the desert. The cruelty of it, the deliberate nature of leaving someone to die slowly in the heat, stirred something dark and familiar in his chest. "These chains," he said, examining the locks. "They're not standard law enforcement equipment. Someone had these made special." Elena watched him work, noting the careful way he handled the metal, the practiced efficiency of his movements. "You were a soldier," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Long time ago," Creek replied, using his knife to probe the lock mechanism. "Different war, different country. Seems like there's always someone who thinks chains are the answer to their problems." He worked in silence for several minutes, his face set in concentration. Elena found herself studying his profile. The grey beard, the deep lines around his eyes, the gentle way he handled her injured wrists. There was something in his manner that reminded her of her father, a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself through violence or loud words. The lock clicked open with a soft, metallic sound that seemed to echo across the desert. Creek caught the chains before they could fall against the rock, setting them aside with a care that suggested respect for Elena's ordeal. Her wrists were bloody and swollen, but she flexed her fingers experimentally. relief flooding her features. "Thank you," she said simply. Creek helped her to her feet, noting the way she favored her left leg and the careful way she moved. 2 days chained to a rock in the desert heat had taken their toll, but her spirit seemed unbroken. He offered her more water and a piece of dried meat from his pack, watching as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd given up hope of another meal. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena Vasquez." "And you?" "Samuel Creek. Most folks just call me Creek." He studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the stubborn set to her jaw. "You said Morrison killed your brother. You witness it?" Elena nodded, her expression hardening. "Miguel was sick, weak from our journey. Morrison's deputy struck him down for trying to protect me. His head hit a rock." She paused, swallowing hard. "Morrison watched it happen and did nothing. Then he ordered them to chain me here, as an example to other families trying to cross." Creek felt the familiar heat of anger building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him through 3 years of war. But this anger was different, cleaner somehow, focused on something that mattered beyond politics or territory. This was about basic human decency, about the strong protecting the weak instead of preying on them. "Morrison's got a reputation in these parts," Creek said carefully. "Man's got half the territorial government in his pocket, plus most of the local ranchers and mine owners. He's not someone you cross lightly." "I'm not asking you to cross him," Elena replied, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "You've already done more than I had any right to expect. If you could just point me toward the nearest town with Morrison looking for you." "You wouldn't make it 5 miles?" Creek shouldered his pack and gestured toward the mountains. "My place is about 6 miles north, well hidden. You can rest there while we figure out what comes next." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. She'd learned to be cautious with men's offers of help, especially when she was alone and vulnerable. But Creek's gray eyes held only honest concern, and something in his manner reminded her of the few truly good men she'd known in her life. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. And helping me makes you Morrison's enemy too." Creek was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if looking back across years of memories. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older regrets. 15 years ago, I came home from the war to find my wife and baby daughter dead of fever. I'd spent 3 years fighting for causes I barely understood, telling myself I was doing something important while the people who actually mattered to me died alone. He looked directly at Elena, and she saw a depth of sorrow in his eyes that matched her own. "Maybe I can't bring them back, but I can make sure one more good person doesn't die alone in the desert, while I stand by and do nothing." Elena felt tears threaten for the first time since Miguel's death. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude for this unexpected kindness from a stranger who had every reason to walk away from her troubles. "I'll slow you down," she said. "I'm hurt, and Morrison will come looking." "Let me worry about Morrison," Creek interrupted gently. "For now, let's just focus on getting you somewhere safe." As they began the careful journey through the rocky terrain toward Creek's hidden cabin, neither of them noticed the dust cloud rising in the distance. Sheriff Morrison and 4 of his deputies, following the trail that would soon lead them to the empty chains and the realization that their example had been undone by someone foolish enough to interfere with territorial justice, the war that Elena feared bringing to Creek's peaceful mountain retreat was already coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Creek's calloused fingers worked carefully at the iron shackles, using his knife point to probe the crude lock mechanism. The metal was hot from the desert sun, and Elena's wrists bore the angry red marks of 2 days' struggle against the unforgiving restraints. When the locks finally clicked open, the sound seemed to echo across the vast emptiness of the Arizona landscape. "There," Creek said softly, catching the heavy chains before they could clatter against the rock. He set them aside with deliberate care, as if honoring the suffering they represented. Elena flexed her fingers, wincing as blood flow returned to her hands, but her dark eyes held only gratitude. "My brother Miguel," she said, her voice still rough from thirst. Before he died, he saw something. Sheriff Morrison meeting with men in the desert at night, wagons full of people. Families like ours, but they weren't being arrested. She paused, accepting another sip of water from Creek's canteen. They were being sold. Creek's weathered face remained impassive, but Elena caught the slight tightening around his grey eyes. In his 15 years of mountain solitude, he'd heard whispers of such things: human trafficking disguised as law enforcement, desperate families exploited by men who wore badges like licenses to steal. He'd chosen to ignore those whispers, telling himself they weren't his concern. Your brother told you this before Morrison's men found you. Miguel was good at staying hidden, watching. He said the sheriff had a ledger, kept records of the money he made. Names, prices, destinations. Elena's voice hardened. That's why Morrison killed him. Miguel wasn't just sick and weak. He was a witness. Creek helped Elena to her feet, noting how she favored her left ankle and the careful way she moved. 2 days of exposure had taken their toll, but her spirit blazed as fiercely as ever. He offered her dried meat from his pack and watched as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd given up hope of another meal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them before either saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Creek's military instincts, honed by 3 years of war and never completely dormant, sharpened his awareness. He counted the rhythm, 4 horses, maybe 5, moving fast across the hardpan. Morrison, Elena whispered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. Creek studied the approaching riders through the heat shimmer, recognizing the purposeful way they spread out as they rode. These weren't casual travelers. They were hunters following a trail. His peaceful mountain retreat suddenly felt very far away. Can you travel? He asked Elena, shouldering his pack with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to move quickly when circumstances demanded it. I can try. Then we go. Now. Sheriff Wade Morrison sat tall in his saddle, his silver badge catching the afternoon sun as he surveyed the empty chains and the signs of Elena's rescue. His cold blue eyes took in every detail, the careful way the locks had been picked, the absence of struggle, marks that would indicate a violent liberation, the single set of boot prints that led away from the scene alongside Elena's smaller tracks. Professional work, Deputy Barnes observed, dismounting to examine the chains more closely. Barnes was a thick-set man with cruel eyes who'd enjoyed watching Elena's suffering during her initial capture. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Morrison's jaw tightened. In his 5 years as sheriff of this territory, no one had dared interfere with his justice. The Mexican families knew better than to help escapees, and the white settlers understood that Morrison's arrangements kept their labor costs low and their properties safe. Someone had just upset a very profitable system. Track them, Morrison ordered, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Whoever's helping her just made the biggest mistake of their life. Deputy Collins, a younger man who still showed occasional flickers of conscience, studied the tracks leading north toward the mountains. Sheriff, maybe we should let this one go. She's just a girl, and her brother's already dead. What harm can she really do? Morrison turned his cold gaze on Collins, and the younger man visibly wilted. That girl witnessed operations that bring in more money than your salary for the next 10 years. Her brother was smart enough to understand what he was seeing, which means she probably is too. He dismounted and walked to where Elena had been chained, running his hand over the smooth rock. Besides, it's not about her anymore. It's about whoever thinks they can undo my work. Creek led Elena through a maze of narrow canyons and hidden trails that he'd learned during his 15 years in the mountains. His military training served him well. He chose routes that would be difficult to follow, paused frequently to listen for pursuit, and used every natural feature to mask their passage. Elena kept pace despite her injuries, though Creek could see the effort it cost her. They'd been traveling for 2 hours when Creek heard the distant echo of hoofbeats against canyon walls. Morrison's men were closer than he'd hoped, and Elena was beginning to tire. He guided her into a narrow cleft between 2 massive boulders, a hiding place he'd discovered years ago while tracking wounded game. Rest, he whispered, offering her water again. They'll pass by if we're quiet. Elena nodded, but Creek could see the fear in her dark eyes. Not fear for herself. He'd already learned she possessed uncommon courage, but fear that her rescue would cost this kind stranger his life. She'd seen enough death already. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by voices carrying in the thin desert air. Creek recognized Morrison's authoritative tone, even from a distance, though he couldn't make out the words. The sheriff was close enough now that any significant noise would bring him down on their hiding place. "There!" Barnes's voice rang clear across the canyon. "Fresh tracks leading into that cleft?" Creek's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, the weight of it familiar and comforting. 15 years of peace had made him soft, but the reflexes remained. If Morrison forced a confrontation, Creek would give as good as he got. But Elena's presence complicated everything. He couldn't risk her safety in a gunfight against professional lawmen, even corrupt ones. Morrison's voice carried clearly now as he approached their hiding place. "Come out peaceful, and maybe you both live through this. Keep hiding, and I'll smoke you out like the vermin you are." Elena started to move, perhaps intending to surrender herself to protect Creek, but he placed a gentle hand on her arm. His grey eyes met hers, and she saw something there that reminded her of her father during the worst of the troubles in Mexico. A quiet man pushed too far, finding depths of strength he'd forgotten he possessed. "My fight now, too," Creek said softly. He stepped out from between the boulders with his hands visible but ready, positioning himself so that Elena remained hidden. Morrison sat his horse 30 yards away, flanked by 4 deputies with their hands resting on their gun butts. Creek recognized the formation. They'd done this before, probably many times. "You picked a poor cause to champion, stranger," Morrison said, his voice conversational but his eyes cold as winter sky. "That girl's a border jumper and a criminal. Helping her makes you an accessory to federal crimes. I see a woman who was left to die in chains," Creek replied calmly. "Where I come from, we call that murder." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Where you come from doesn't matter now. What matters is that you've interfered with territorial law enforcement, and that's a hanging offense in my jurisdiction." Behind Morrison, Deputy Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Creek caught the movement and filed it away. Not all of Morrison's men were completely corrupt. "That might matter later. Your jurisdiction," Creek repeated thoughtfully. "Funny thing about jurisdiction. Last I checked, chaining women to rocks wasn't covered in any law book I've read. Mexican border jumpers aren't covered by most law books either," Morrison replied. "They're more like livestock, property of whoever finds them first." The casual cruelty of that statement hit Creek like a physical blow. He'd heard such talk during the war, from men who'd forgotten the difference between enemies and human beings. It was the kind of thinking that had driven him into the mountains in the first place, seeking escape from a world where good men could become monsters and monsters could wear badges. "Elena," Creek called over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off Morrison. "You hear that? The sheriff thinks you're livestock." Elena emerged from the cleft with her chin raised and fire in her dark eyes. Creek had hoped she'd stay hidden, but he should have known better. She'd already shown him she wasn't the type to cower while others fought her battles. "I heard," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "I also heard you tell Deputy Barnes to make my death look accidental when you chained me to that rock. You didn't want questions from the territorial authorities about why Mexican families keep disappearing from your jurisdiction." Morrison's face darkened. "You're dreaming, girl. Nobody's going to believe the word of a border jumper over a territorial sheriff." "Maybe not," Elena agreed. "But they might believe the word of my brother Miguel, who watched you take money from slavers before he died. He wasn't as weak as you thought, Sheriff. He saw everything." The silence stretched taut between them. Creek watched Morrison's face carefully, noting the slight tick that had developed near his left eye. Elena had struck a nerve, which meant her accusations were true. "Your brother's dead," Morrison said finally. "Dead men don't testify." "No," Elena replied, "but they sometimes write things down." "Miguel kept a journal, Sheriff. Names, dates, places. Everything he saw during our journey north, including your midnight meetings with men who buy and sell human beings." Creek couldn't tell if Elena was bluffing or telling the truth. But Morrison's reaction suggested the sheriff believed her. The tic near his eye had become more pronounced, and his hand now rested openly on his gun butt. "Where is it?" Morrison demanded. "Somewhere safe," Elena lied smoothly. "Somewhere your men will never find it." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention back to Creek. "You know what you've gotten yourself into, mountain man? This isn't some romantic rescue story. That girl's got information that could destroy everything I've built here. I can't let her leave this canyon alive." Creek felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. 15 years ago, he'd come home from war, swearing he'd never again be forced to choose between his conscience and his survival. The mountains had offered him peace, solitude, and the simple certainty of natural law. But Elena's courage and Morrison's casual cruelty had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead and buried. "Then I guess you'll have to go through me," Creek said quietly. Morrison smiled without warmth. "That can be arranged. You're outnumbered 5-1, and I've got the law on my side. Even if you kill me, which you won't, my deputies have standing orders to bring in border jumpers dead or alive." 5-1, Creek mused, glancing at the men flanking Morrison. "I faced worse odds. He had too. At Antietam and Gettysburg, charging Confederate positions with nothing but rifle and bayonet. But that was 20 years ago, when he was young and quick and had something to prove. Now he was 52, out of practice, and protecting someone who couldn't protect herself." Elena stepped up beside him, and Creek saw she'd picked up a heavy stone from the canyon floor. She might not be armed, but she wasn't going down without a fight either. "Last chance," Morrison said, drawing his pistol. "Give me the girl, and you can ride away from this. Otherwise, I'll add resisting arrest and assaulting an officer to your gravestone." Creek looked at Elena, really looked at her. The fierce determination in her dark eyes, the stubborn set to her jaw, the way she held herself ready to fight despite being outnumbered and outgunned. She reminded him so much of Sarah, who'd faced her own death with the same quiet courage, but Sarah had died alone while he was away fighting someone else's war. Elena wouldn't. "Come and take her," Creek said. Morrison's face hardened into the cold mask of a man who'd killed before and would kill again. So be it. The gunfight that followed would be talked about in Copper Wells for years to come, though the details would change with each telling. What remained constant was that Sheriff Morrison discovered that afternoon that 15 years of peaceful solitude hadn't dulled Samuel. Creek's war-honed instincts, as much as anyone might have expected. When the smoke cleared, Morrison and one deputy were dead, another was wounded, and Collins had thrown down his gun rather than continue fighting for a cause he'd never believed in. Creek had taken a bullet in his shoulder, but Elena's quick thinking with a sling and well-aimed stones had evened the odds just enough. As Creek bandaged his wound with Elena's help, Deputy Collins approached them carefully, his hands raised and empty. "I'm done with this," Collins said. "Morrison had us all scared, but this," he gestured at the carnage around them, "this isn't law enforcement. This is just murder dressed up with badges." Elena studied the young deputy's face, seeing shame and genuine regret there. "You knew what Morrison was doing?" "Suspected," Collins admitted. "But proving it and doing something about it are different things. Morrison had connections all the way to the territorial capital. Men who disappear in the desert don't usually get much investigation." Creek finished tying off his bandage and looked at Collins thoughtfully. "What happens now?" "Now I ride back to town and report that Sheriff Morrison died in the line of duty, pursuing dangerous fugitives who escaped into the mountains." Collins met Creek's eyes steadily. "I never saw either of you," Elena frowned. "You'd lie for us?" "I'd tell the truth for once," Collins corrected. "Morrison was the criminal here. Whatever you two do next, you've got a head start, but it won't last long. Morrison had friends in high places, and they'll send someone else to finish what he started." Creek helped Elena gather what supplies they could from the dead men's horses, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested the movement. Collins was right. This was just the beginning. They'd won a battle, but the war was far from over, As they prepared to leave the canyon, where Elena's chains had been broken and Morrison's corruption had finally met its match, Elena turned to Creek with tears in her dark eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "You came to these mountains for peace, and I've brought you nothing but trouble." Creek looked back at the bodies of Morrison and his deputy, then at the young woman whose courage had reawakened his own conscience. For the first time in 15 years, he felt truly alive. "Maybe trouble was what I needed," he said. 3 days after the gunfight in the canyon, Creek and Elena reached the relative safety of his hidden cabin in the mountains. The journey had been grueling. Creek's shoulder wound made climbing difficult, and Elena's exhaustion from her ordeal finally caught up with her once the immediate danger had passed. They'd traveled mostly at night, using game trails and hidden paths that Creek had learned during his 15 years of solitude. The cabin itself was a testament to Creek's need for both security and invisibility. Built into a natural alcove of red stone, it could only be approached from one direction, and that path was concealed by carefully arranged boulders and desert vegetation. Inside, the space was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with books that spoke of a man who valued knowledge over material possessions. Elena sat by the small fire Creek had built, turning over the wooden cross in her hands. She'd carved it herself during their journey from Mexico, using Miguel's knife to shape the soft pine wood during the long, fearful nights when they'd huddled together for warmth. The cross was crude work, nothing like the beautiful religious art her mother had once created. But it held all her love for her lost brother. "He wanted to be a teacher," she said softly, tracing the rough edges with her fingertip. "Miguel was always reading when he could find books, always asking questions about how things worked. Even when we were starving, he'd share his food with stray dogs because he said they didn't choose to be hungry any more than we did." Creek cleaned his rifle methodically, though his grey eyes remained focused on Elena's face. In the 3 days since Morrison's death, he'd watched grief work its way through her. First the numbness of shock, then the raw pain of loss, and now this quiet remembrance that honored her brother's memory. "What happened to your village?" he asked gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Men came in the night. Not soldiers exactly, but not bandits either. They wore no uniforms, but they moved like military. They said our village was harboring rebels against the government. But there were no rebels, just farmers and craftspeople trying to live their lives." She paused, her knuckles white where she gripped the wooden cross. "They burned the church first, then the school. Said education made people ask too many questions. My father tried to protect the books. He was the village teacher before Miguel was born. They shot him for interfering with their work." Creek felt the familiar weight of old anger settling in his chest. He'd seen too much of such brutality during the war, men using authority as an excuse for cruelty, power corrupting even those who'd started with good intentions. It was part of what had driven him to seek solitude in these mountains. "Your mother?" "Fever took her 2 months later. I think her heart was already broken from losing Papa and watching everything we'd built turn to ash." Elena's voice grew stronger, carrying the steel that Creek had already learned to respect. "Before she died, she made me promise to get Miguel to safety. She said America was a place where books weren't burned, where people could ask questions without being shot for it." Creek set down his rifle and moved to the small shelf where he kept his most precious possessions. Among them was his worn leather journal, filled with 15 years of observations about weather, wildlife, and the slow changing of seasons. But tucked between the pages were sketches, detailed drawings of landscapes, animals, and occasionally human faces. Sarah's face appeared more than once, drawn from memory during the lonely years after her death. "Your mother wasn't wrong about America," he said, returning to his chair by the fire. "But she probably didn't know that some Americans can be just as cruel as the men who burned your village. Morrison and his kind, they use the law the same way those men used government authority. As an excuse to hurt people they consider beneath them." Elena studied Creek's weathered face in the firelight. "You've seen it before. That's why you live alone out here, among other reasons." Creek opened his journal and showed her a sketch of a young woman holding a baby, Sarah and their daughter Mary, drawn from a memory that had grown more precious with each passing year. I came home from the war to find my family dead. Fever took them while I was off fighting for causes that seemed less important every day. How old was she? Your daughter, 6 months. Just starting to smile according to Sarah's letters. I never saw her take her first steps or heard her first words. Creek's voice carried 15 years of accumulated regret. I told myself I was fighting for their future, protecting them from enemies who threatened our way of life. But the real enemy was disease and poverty, things bullets couldn't solve. Elena reached out and touched the sketch gently. She was beautiful. They both were. Sarah had your courage. When the fever came, she took in 3 other children whose parents had already died, tried to nurse them all back to health by herself. Creek closed the journal carefully. She died protecting other people's children while I was 1,000 miles away, protecting other people's politics. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in memories of people they'd loved and lost. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the rocks, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Creek found himself stealing glances at Elena, noting the way the firelight brought out the bronze in her dark hair and the stubborn line of her jaw that reminded him so much of Sarah. You said Miguel kept a journal, Creek said eventually. Was that true, or were you just trying to rattle Morrison? Elena smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their first meeting. Miguel did write things down, but not in a journal. He carved words into pieces of wood, small things he could hide easily. He said words had power, and if something happened to us, maybe someone would find his words and know what we'd seen. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small piece of carved wood, no bigger than Creek's thumb. The words were tiny but clear, carved with the patience and precision of someone who understood their importance. Sheriff Morrison, Creek read aloud. Money from Wagon Man. 20 families. Full moon October. There are 6 more pieces, Elena said. Miguel hid them in different places during our journey. Names, dates, descriptions of the men he saw buying people from Morrison. If someone found them all, they'd have enough evidence to bring down Morrison's entire network. Creek studied the small carving, marveling at the courage it had taken for a sick 15-year-old boy to document such dangerous information. Where are the other pieces? Scattered along our route from the border to Copper Wells. Miguel said if something happened to us, at least the truth would survive, even if we didn't. Creek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Elena was right about what Miguel had documented, and if Morrison's associates found those carved pieces before honest authorities did, then Elena would never be safe. She wasn't just a witness to one crime. She was the key to unraveling an entire criminal organization. We need to find them, he said. Elena shook her head. Too dangerous. Morrison's friends will be watching every trail between here and the border, and I can't remember exactly where Miguel hid everything. Some of the locations were while he was delirious from fever. Then we make them come to us. What do you mean? Creek stood and moved to another shelf, this one holding maps of the territory and supplies he'd accumulated during his years in the mountains. Among them was something he hadn't touched in over a decade, his old army field kit, complete with signal mirrors, coded message materials, and other tools from his military intelligence days. Morrison had connections in the territorial government, you said, men who profited from his trafficking operation. Creek spread a map on the rough wooden table, marking locations with practiced efficiency. Those men will send someone to replace Morrison, probably someone even more dangerous. But they'll want to clean up loose ends first, which means finding Miguel's evidence and eliminating any witnesses. Elena joined him at the table, her dark eyes following his movements across the map. You're talking about using me as bait. I'm talking about turning the tables. Instead of running from Morrison's people, we make them run toward a trap of our choosing. Creek traced a route through the canyons and mesas surrounding his hidden valley. But first, we need to know who we're fighting. He pulled out his signal mirror and adjusted its angle to catch the late afternoon sun. 3 long flashes, 2 short ones repeated twice. Elena watched in fascination as Creek sent the coded message toward a distant peak. "Who are you signaling?" "Old friend from the war. Tom Brennan runs a trading post about 15 miles south of here. He keeps his ears open about territorial politics and doesn't ask too many questions about why a hermit might need information." 20 minutes later, an answering flash came from the distant peak. Creek read the pattern of light signals with the ease of long practice, his expression growing grimmer with each coded message. "Well?" Elena asked. "Morrison's replacement is already on his way. Man named Colonel James Hartwell, formerly of the Confederate Army. Word is, he specializes in cleaning up other people's messes and doesn't much care about legal niceties." Elena felt a chill settle in her stomach. "How long do we have? 2 days, maybe 3. Hartwell's bringing a dozen men with him, all veterans like himself. They'll set up operations in copper wells and start systematically hunting for Miguel's evidence and for you." Creek rolled up the map and returned it to the shelf, his movements sharp and decisive. Elena recognized the change in him. The easygoing mountain man was giving way to something harder and more dangerous. A man who'd spent 3 years learning how to kill efficiently and survive against impossible odds. "There's something else," he said. "Tom's message mentioned bounties. Hartwell's put $1,000 on your head, 500 for information leading to your capture. That's enough money to turn every drifter and desperate man in the territory into a bounty hunter." Elena sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the forces arrayed against them. $1,000 was more money than most people in this territory saw in 5 years. How could they possibly survive against such odds? "Maybe I should just run," she said quietly. "Go back to Mexico, try to disappear. This isn't your fight, Mr. Creek. You've already done more than anyone could ask." Creek studied her face in the firelight, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide beneath her stubborn courage. For a moment, he was transported back 15 years to another firelit room. Another brave woman facing impossible odds while he prepared to ride away to war. "You know what I told Sarah the night before I left for the war?" he said softly. "I told her I'd come back to her, that nothing would keep me away from her and our baby. I promised her that no matter what happened, I'd find a way home." Elena waited, sensing the importance of this memory. "But I didn't come home in time. I let duty and honor and other men's causes keep me away, while the people who mattered most to me died alone." Creek's gray eyes met hers across the small cabin. "I won't make that mistake again. This is my fight now, too." Elena felt tears threaten, touched by the depth of conviction in his voice. "Your shoulder's still wounded. You said yourself we're outnumbered 12 to 1, and these men are experienced killers. So am I." Creek interrupted gently. "I spent 3 years learning how to survive when outnumbered and outgunned. The Confederate Army had better weapons, better training, and more men than we did at Antietam and Gettysburg. We won anyway. How?" Creek smiled, and for the first time, Elena saw a glimpse of the soldier he'd once been. Confident, dangerous, and absolutely certain of his capabilities. By choosing the battlefield. By making our enemies come to us on our terms, in terrain we knew better than they did. He gestured toward the maps and military equipment. By remembering that courage and cunning can overcome almost any disadvantage. Elena looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man who'd risked everything to save her from Morrison's chains. Miguel's wooden cross felt warm in her hands, and she thought she could feel her brother's presence in the shadows cast by the firelight. "What do you need me to do?" Creek began spreading maps and sketching positions, his mind already working through tactics and possibilities. "First, we gather intelligence. Tom Brennan knows everyone who matters in this territory. We need to find out exactly who else was involved in Morrison's operation. Then we start making them nervous. How? By letting word slip that Miguel's journal exists and that you know where to find it. Make them come to us instead of forcing us to hunt them down across the entire territory." Elena studied the tactical drawings Creek was making, recognizing the intelligence behind his planning. "You really think we can win?" Creek paused in his sketching and looked at her directly. "I think Miguel was brave enough to document the truth even when he was dying. I think you were strong enough to survive being chained in the desert and smart enough to use that truth as a weapon. And I think sometimes the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do." He returned to his planning. But Elena caught the slight smile that crossed his weathered face. "Besides," he added, "Hartwell and his men are expecting to hunt down a terrified Mexican girl, and whatever local fool was stupid enough to help her. They're not expecting to face someone who's been preparing for this kind of fight since before they were born." Elena felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced since Miguel's death. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone praying for rescue, but the fierce hope of someone preparing to fight back. Outside, the desert wind continued its endless song through the rocks, carrying no hint of the storm that was gathering in the hidden valley where a mountain man and a Mexican refugee began planning their war against men who bought and sold human beings like livestock. Creek opened his military field pack for the first time in 15 years. The leather worn smooth by hard use during 3 years of war. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his Medal of Honor, a bronze star suspended from a blue ribbon, awarded for actions at Gettysburg that he'd never spoken about to anyone, not even Sarah. He'd buried the medal along with his uniform and his commission papers when he'd retreated to these mountains, wanting no reminders of the man he'd been when killing was his profession. Elena watched from across the cabin as Creek handled the decoration with reverence rather than pride. The firelight caught the bronze, making it gleam like something precious, though she could see in Creek's weathered face that its weight came from memory rather than metal. "You never told me you were decorated," she said softly. "Decorations are for parades and politicians," Creek replied, rewrapping the medal carefully. "I kept this because it belonged to better men than me, the ones who didn't make it home to receive theirs." He moved to the small mirror mounted on the cabin wall and studied his reflection critically. 15 years of mountain living had weathered his face and silvered his hair, but the eyes that looked back at him held the same steady resolve that had carried him through Antietam and Shiloh. The body was older, slower, but the mind that had outthought Confederate cavalry and survived behind enemy lines remained sharp. "Tell me about Gettysburg," Elena said, sensing that understanding Creek's past was crucial to surviving their future. Creek was quiet for a long moment, his hand unconsciously moving to touch his left ribs, where an old scar still ached in cold weather. Third day of fighting, Confederate General Pickett ordered 15,000 men to charge across open ground toward our position on Cemetery Ridge. Longest mile of real estate in American history, no cover, no concealment, just courage and desperation. Elena watched his face, seeing shadows of old pain and older guilt. My unit was positioned behind a stone wall, perfect cover for picking off anyone who made it close enough. But Pickett's men kept coming anyway, walking into rifle fire like they were strolling to church. Creek's voice grew distant. "Takes a special kind of courage to keep advancing when you know you're going to die. Is that when you earned the medal?" "No, the medal came after, when I went over that wall." Creek turned from the mirror to face Elena directly. "Pickett's charge failed, but some of his men made it close enough to touch our stone wall before they fell. Young boys, most of them, crying for their mothers while they bled out in the Pennsylvania sun." Elena felt her breath catch, recognizing something profound in Creek's voice. "I couldn't watch them die like that. War's one thing, but leaving wounded boys to suffer when you could help them." Creek shook his head. "I went over the wall with my medical kit. Spent 2 hours in no man's land, dragging wounded Confederates back to our lines for treatment. The medal was for saving enemy soldiers, for demonstrating that even in war, some things matter more than sides." Creek moved to his rifle and began the methodical process of cleaning and checking it. "Confederate sniper put a bullet through my ribs while I was carrying their wounded lieutenant to safety. Could have killed me easy, but he was young too. Probably figured shooting a man trying to save lives wasn't the kind of soldier he wanted to be." Elena understood now why Creek had chosen isolation after the war, and why her situation had awakened something in him that 15 years of peaceful solitude hadn't been able to bury. He was a man who couldn't walk away from suffering, even when walking away was the smart thing to do. "Colonel Hartwell," she said. "You think he's the type who'd shoot medical personnel?" Greek's laugh held no humor. "James Hartwell isn't interested in being any type of soldier. He's a mercenary who uses military titles to legitimize brutality. The kind of man who gives real soldiers a bad name." He spread a detailed map of the territory on the table, marking locations with practiced precision. Elena noticed that his movements had changed over the past few days. Less of the easygoing mountain man, more of the tactical officer who'd survived 3 years of the bloodiest war in American history. "Here's what we know," Creek said, pointing to various marks on the map. "Hartwell's setting up operations in Copper Wells, using Morrison's old office as his headquarters. He's brought 12 men with him, all Confederate veterans like himself. They're systematic, disciplined, and they don't much care about territorial law since they're operating with federal backing." Elena studied the map, noting the careful way Creek had marked patrol routes, supply lines, and defensive positions. "How do you know all this?" "Tom Brennan's trading post sees every traveler in this territory. Men like Hartwell need supplies, ammunition, and information. Tom provides all three, while keeping careful notes about who's buying what." Creek tapped a location 15 miles south of their position. "Tom's been sending me signal messages twice daily since Hartwell arrived. The man's not subtle about his intentions." Elena leaned closer to examine the tactical markings. "What kind of intentions?" "Hartwell's posted bounties in every town within 100 miles. $1,000 for you alive, 500 dead. But more importantly, he's been asking specific questions about Miguel's journal. Someone's told him about the carved pieces your brother left behind." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach. "Who would know about that?" "Could be anyone who was listening when you confronted Morrison in the canyon. Sound carries in desert air, and we weren't exactly being quiet." Creek marked another position on the map. "Or it could be someone Miguel trusted during your journey north. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider. Miguel was careful about who he talked to. Careful isn't the same as invisible. A sick boy asking questions, writing things down. Someone noticed. And now Hartwell knows there's evidence that could destroy the entire trafficking network." Creek's grey eyes met hers across the map. "The question is whether we can find Miguel's carvings before Hartwell does." Elena pulled Miguel's wooden cross from her pocket, turning it over in her hands while she thought. The rough carving had become her talisman during the dark days since her brother's death. A tangible connection to his courage and determination. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said quietly. "Miguel was feverish during the last week of our journey, but he had moments of clarity. During one of them, he told me he'd left more than just carved words." Creek looked up from the map. "What do you mean?" "He said he'd drawn pictures too. Maps showing where Morrison met with the wagon men, sketches of faces he recognized, even rough drawings of the trails they used to move people without being seen by honest lawmen." Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Miguel wasn't just documenting crimes. He was creating a complete record of Morrison's operation." Creek felt his pulse quicken. If Elena was right, Miguel had compiled evidence that would not only expose the trafficking ring, but provide enough detail to track down and arrest everyone involved. No wonder Hartwell was being so systematic in his search. "Do you remember where he might have hidden these drawings?" Elena closed her eyes, trying to recall those final desperate days when Miguel's fever had been breaking and reforming like desert weather. He was obsessed with caves during his delirium. Kept talking about how caves preserved things, how Native Americans used them to store important items for future generations. "There are dozens of caves in the territory between here and the border," Creek said thoughtfully. "Some natural, some carved by ancient peoples, some used by outlaws for hideouts." Miguel was drawn to the ones with drawings already on the walls. He said pictures spoke to pictures, that his evidence would be safe among the old stories. Elena opened her eyes and looked at Creek with sudden intensity. "He called them galleries of truth." Creek studied the map with new understanding. He knew several cave systems that matched Elena's description. places where ancient peoples had painted their stories on stone walls, creating galleries of images that had survived for centuries. If Miguel had hidden his evidence in such places, it would be well protected from weather and difficult for searchers to find without specific knowledge. "I know 4 caves that fit that description," he said, marking new locations on the map. "But reaching them means crossing open ground where Hartwell's men are conducting search patterns. Then we make them think we're going somewhere else." Creek looked at Elena with growing respect. Her mind worked tactically, thinking like someone who understood that survival often depended on misdirection and careful planning. She was learning to think like a soldier, which might be the only thing that kept them both alive. "What do you have in mind?" Elena moved to Creek's shelf of books and pulled down a volume of territorial surveys, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. Miguel was fascinated by maps, always studying them when he could find them. But he was also smart enough to know that obvious hiding places would be searched first. She pointed to a detailed geological survey showing cave systems throughout the territory. "These are the caves that are marked on official maps, the ones Hartwell's men will search systematically." But Miguel wouldn't have used any of these. Creek followed her reasoning. He'd have found unmarked caves, places that locals knew about, but that didn't appear in government surveys. Exactly. And there's only one way to find unmarked caves in territory you don't know. You ask the people who've lived there longest. Elena turned to another map. This one showing the locations of various Native American settlements and traditional gathering places. Miguel spent 2 days with a group of Apache women near Wilcox Springs. They fed him, treated his fever, and in return he helped them with some wagon repairs. He was good with his hands, could fix almost anything. Creek felt a surge of admiration for the boy he'd never met. Even while sick and fleeing for his life, Miguel had found ways to earn help through honest work rather than begging or stealing. It spoke to the character that Elena and her family had instilled in him. "You think the Apache women told him about hidden caves?" I think Miguel asked the right questions and listened carefully to the answers. He always said the best hiding places were the ones that looked like they'd been forgotten, but were really just being protected. Creek marked the location of Wilcox Springs on his map, noting its distance from their current position and the terrain they'd have to cross to reach it. It was a dangerous journey, 40 miles of desert and canyon country, much of it now patrolled by Hartwell's men. "Even if you're right, even if we find Miguel's evidence, what then?" Creek asked. "Hartwell has federal backing for his operation. Local territorial authorities won't move against him without overwhelming proof. And by the time we could get word to honest federal marshals—" "We don't need federal marshals," Elena interrupted. "We need to turn Hartwell's own methods against him." Creek raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the steel in her voice. "Hartwell's using bounty hunters and mercenaries because he can't trust regular lawmen to ignore the moral implications of hunting an innocent woman. But mercenaries are only loyal as long as they're being paid better than anyone else." Elena moved to the window and looked out at the desert landscape, her profile strong and determined in the afternoon light. What if Hartwell's employers decided he'd become a liability? What if they thought he was drawing too much attention to their operation? Creek began to understand her thinking. "You want to make Hartwell's superiors believe he's lost control of the situation. I want to make them believe that keeping him alive is more dangerous than cutting him loose." Elena turned back to Creek with fire in her dark eyes. "Miguel's evidence doesn't just prove Morrison's guilt. It proves federal corruption at the highest levels. Men that powerful don't survive by loyalty to subordinates. They survive by eliminating anyone who threatens their position." Creek felt a slow smile spread across his weathered face. Elena wasn't just learning to think tactically. She was learning to think politically, understanding that their enemy's greatest weakness might be their lack of trust in each other. "You're talking about turning a hunting party into a circular firing squad. I'm talking about giving powerful men a reason to solve our problem for us." Elena returned to the map table and began studying the marked positions with new intensity. "But first we need Miguel's evidence. Real proof, not just my word against theirs. Creek nodded, already beginning to plan their approach to Wilcox Springs. It would be dangerous. They'd have to cross territory that Hartwell's men were actively patrolling, and they'd be moving away from the hidden canyon that provided their only secure base. But Elena was right about the stakes. Without concrete evidence, they were just fugitives hoping to stay ahead of superior forces. With Miguel's documentation, they became something much more dangerous. People who could expose an entire network of corruption and force powerful men to choose between their profits and their survival. "We leave at sunset," Creek said, beginning to gather the equipment they'd need for the journey. Travel by night, hide during the day, and pray that Miguel was as clever about hiding evidence as he was about everything else. Elena picked up her brother's wooden cross and held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight streaming through the cabin window. For a moment, the crude carving seemed to glow with inner light, and she felt Miguel's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside her. "He was," she said quietly. "Miguel was the smartest person I ever knew. If anyone could hide evidence so well that only family could find it, it would be him." Creek finished his preparations and shouldered his pack, noting how Elena moved with new confidence and purpose. The frightened girl he'd rescued from Morrison's chains was becoming something harder and more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Then let's go find what your brother left for us," he said. Elena's mother's ring caught the firelight as she turned it slowly between her fingers. The simple gold band was the only thing of value she'd carried across the border, hidden in the lining of her dress during the long journey from Sonora. Maria Vasquez had pressed it into Elena's hand during her final illness, making her daughter promise to wear it only when she found a place where love could flourish without fear. "Mama said this ring traveled from Spain to Mexico with my great-grandmother," Elena said softly, watching the way the gold gleamed in the lamplight. "Through wars, revolutions, famines, it survived everything because the women who wore it understood that some things are worth preserving, no matter the cost." Creek looked up from the detailed maps he'd been studying, noting the reverence in Elena's voice. In the week since Morrison's death, he'd learned to read the subtle changes in her expression, the way her eyes grew distant when memories of family overcame her, the stubborn set to her jaw when she was working through complex problems. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. She was brave in ways that men never had to be," Elena replied, slipping the ring onto her finger for the first time since leaving Mexico. "Papa fought soldiers and bandits with guns and courage. Mama fought hunger and disease and hopelessness with nothing but determination and love." Elena moved to the small window and looked out at the star-filled desert sky. "When the men came to burn our village, Papa wanted to fight them directly. Mama convinced him to hide the children first, to save what could be saved rather than dying for what was already lost." Creek felt the familiar weight of old guilt settling on his shoulders. Sarah had possessed that same practical courage, the kind that made hard choices based on love rather than pride. She died protecting other people's children while he was away fighting other people's wars. "Did your mother know you'd have to leave Mexico?" "She started preparing us months before we actually fled, teaching Miguel and me to speak better English, showing us how to navigate by stars, making us practice moving quietly through difficult terrain." Elena's voice carried a mixture of grief and admiration. "She called it preparing for possibilities. But we all knew she was preparing us to survive without her." Creek spread a new map on the table, this one showing the route they'd need to take to reach Wilcox Springs and the Apache settlement where Miguel had spent those crucial 2 days. The journey would take them through 40 miles of dangerous territory, much of it now patrolled by Hartwell's systematic search teams. "Your mother was a tactician," he said, with genuine respect, "teaching you to think ahead, to prepare for multiple contingencies. That's what kept you and Miguel alive, as long as you did." Elena joined him at the map table, studying the marked routes and defensive positions with eyes that had learned to see terrain tactically. "Mama also taught me that survival isn't just about avoiding danger, it's about knowing when to stand and fight." She pointed to a narrow canyon marked on the map about 15 miles south of their position. Miguel and I camped here for 2 nights during our journey north. There were other families nearby, all of them fleeing different kinds of violence in Mexico. The children were hungry, some of them sick. Creek noted the strategic importance of the location: water, defensible positions, multiple escape routes. It would have been a natural gathering place for refugees, which also made it a natural hunting ground for men like Morrison. What happened? Elena's expression hardened. Morrison's deputies found the camp on our second night. They said anyone who could pay the border crossing tax would be allowed to continue north. Anyone who couldn't would be arrested for illegal entry. How much was the tax? $50 per adult, $25 per child. More money than most of these families had seen in their entire lives. Elena's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. One family had a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with a fever that wouldn't break. Her parents offered Morrison's men everything they owned: their tools, their animals, even the silver cross her grandmother had worn, but it wasn't enough cash. Creek could see where this story was leading, and he felt anger building in his chest like a slow burning fire. Morrison's men took the healthy children from families who couldn't pay, claiming they were evidence of illegal entry. Said the children would be held in territorial custody until their parents could raise the money for proper fines and legal representation. They were selling the children to families in the north who wanted cheap labor, or to men who... Elena's voice broke slightly. Miguel saw the wagons leaving camp in the middle of the night. Children crying for their parents, parents begging to follow their babies into whatever hell Morrison had arranged for them. Creek moved around the table and placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. What did your mother teach you about situations like that? Elena took a shaky breath, drawing strength from Creek's steady presence. She said there are times when a person has to choose between their safety and their soul. That living with cowardice is worse than dying with courage. You tried to help. Miguel and I followed the wagons. We were just 2 more refugee children. The guards paid no attention to us. When they stopped to rest the horses, Miguel created a distraction while I cut the ropes holding the children in the wagon beds. Elena pulled Miguel's wooden cross from her pocket, running her fingers over the rough carving. We only managed to free 6 children before the guards noticed, but those 6 made it back to their families. The other families scattered after that, too frightened to stay together any longer. Creek studied Elena's face in the lamplight, seeing the strength that her mother had passed down through generations of women who'd faced impossible choices with quiet courage. No wonder Miguel had been brave. Enough to document Morrison's crimes. He'd learned from watching his sister risk everything to save children she didn't even know. Your mother would be proud of what you did, would she? 6 children saved, but 8 others lost forever because we couldn't free them all. Elena's voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that Creek recognized from his own war experiences. Sometimes I wonder if trying to help was the right choice, or if we just made everything worse. Creek was quiet for a long moment, remembering his own struggles with similar questions after Gettysburg. How many Confederate soldiers had died because he'd chosen to save others? How many Union soldiers had lived because his medical aid had allowed wounded enemies to return to battle? During the war, he said finally, I knew a chaplain who used to say that perfect good was God's work, but imperfect good was human work. He said our job wasn't to save everyone. It was to save who we could and trust that others would save who they could. Elena looked up at him, searching his weathered face for the wisdom that came from surviving similar moral challenges. Your 6 children are alive because you and Miguel chose courage over safety. The 8 you couldn't save. That's Morrison's sin, not yours. Elena nodded slowly, though Creek could see she was still wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. It was one of the things he'd come to admire about her. She felt the weight of other people's suffering as if it were her own, which made her dangerous to men like Morrison and Hartwell, who counted on good people looking the other way. Miguel drew pictures of those children's faces. She said quietly, both the ones we saved and the ones we lost. He said if we couldn't save them all, at least we could remember them all. Creek felt a chill of understanding. If Miguel had included those drawings with his other evidence, it would provide proof not just of Morrison's corruption, but of the specific crimes he'd committed against individual families. Personal stories that would make his abstract crimes concrete and undeniable. "Elena," he said carefully, "when you found Miguel's journal pieces, were there drawings mixed in with the written evidence?" "Some. Mostly faces and places, but a few showing the wagons, the guards, the routes they used." Elena's eyes widened as she understood the implications. "You think Miguel's drawings could identify other victims?" "I think Miguel may have documented the entire trafficking operation from the perspective of someone who'd actually witnessed it. Names, faces, routes, methods, everything federal investigators would need to build cases against everyone involved." Elena stood and moved to the window again, looking out at the desert landscape where so many desperate families had tried to find safety and found only predators instead. Her mother's ring caught the starlight, and for a moment she felt Maria Vasquez's presence as strongly as if her mother was standing beside her. "There's something else," she said. "Something I haven't told you about our time with the Apache women at Wilcox Springs." Creek waited, recognizing the tone that meant Elena was about to share something important. "Miguel was delirious with fever for most of our time there, but during his lucid moments he talked with an old woman named Ayana. She spoke Spanish as well as English and Apache, and she'd lived in this territory for 70 years. Elena turned from the window to face Creek directly. "Ayana told Miguel stories about the old days, before the white settlers came. She said her people had always known that certain places were sacred, that they held power that should be respected rather than exploited." "Did she tell him about specific places?" "She told him about caves, where her ancestors had painted their stories on stone walls, places where truth could be preserved for future generations. But more importantly, she told him which caves were protected by what she called guardian spirits, places where hidden things would be safe from those who meant harm." Creek felt his pulse quicken. If the Apache woman had guided Miguel to genuinely sacred sites for hiding his evidence, places that local tribes still protected and monitored, it would explain why Hartwell's systematic searches had turned up nothing. Did Ayana give Miguel specific directions? Better than directions, she gave him symbols. Elena pulled a small piece of cloth from her dress pocket, unfolding it to reveal faded markings drawn in what looked like charcoal and berry juice. "Miguel copied these before we left the Apache camp. Ayana said they were markers that would guide him to the right caves, but only if he understood what he was really looking for." Creek studied the symbols carefully, recognizing some elements from his years of trading with various tribal groups in the territory. The markings seemed to indicate directions, but also concepts: protection, truth, remembrance, guidance. "This isn't just a map," he said slowly. "It's a spiritual guide. Ayana wasn't just helping Miguel hide evidence, she was trusting him with sacred knowledge." Elena nodded. "She said Miguel had eyes that see truly, and that truth-tellers were welcome in sacred places, regardless of their blood or their tribe. She made him promise that if anything happened to him, someone who loved him would follow the symbols to recover what he'd hidden." Creek felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Finding Miguel's evidence had become more than a tactical necessity. It was now a sacred trust, a promise made by a dying boy to an Apache elder who'd recognized his courage and honored it with her people's most protected knowledge. "Then we follow the symbols," he said simply, "and we pray that Miguel's trust in Ayana's wisdom was justified." Elena folded the cloth carefully and returned it to her pocket, her movements reverent. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain. And somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other across the vast emptiness that had become a battleground between those who exploited the desperate and those who protected them. "Mama always said that some fights choose us rather than the other way around," Elena said softly. "I think she'd understand why we can't walk away from this one." Creek gathered his weapons and equipment, preparing for the journey that would take them deeper into hostile territory in search of a dead boy's legacy. Then let's make sure we're worthy of the trust Miguel and Ayana placed in us. The leather-bound ledger lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Sheriff Morrison's old office, exactly where Creek's military intelligence training suggested it would be. Men like Morrison always kept insurance policies, detailed records that could destroy their superiors if circumstances required desperate measures. Creek had seen similar arrangements during the war, when corrupt quartermasters and crooked officers maintained careful documentation of their crimes as protection against betrayal. Elena knelt beside him in the darkness of the abandoned office, her heart pounding as Creek carefully lifted the heavy book from its hiding place. 3 days of careful observation had confirmed that Colonel Hartwell was using the building as his headquarters, but his systematic search patterns left predictable gaps in coverage, windows of opportunity for those patient enough to wait and skilled enough to exploit them. Morrison's insurance policy, Creek whispered, opening the ledger to reveal page after page of meticulous entries. Names, dates, amounts, destinations, everything documented with the precision of a man who understood that his survival depended on having leverage over his partners. Elena leaned closer, her dark eyes scanning the cramped handwriting by the light of Creek's shielded lantern. The entries painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond the territorial borders, involving federal marshals, military suppliers, and politicians whose names she recognized from newspapers. "Sweet Mary," she breathed, pointing to an entry dated 3 months ago. "Senator Patterson from New Mexico Territory, $5,000 for consultation services regarding border security." Creek turned pages carefully, his weathered face growing grimmer with each revelation. Morrison hadn't just been trafficking desperate families, he'd been part of a network that stretched from Mexico to Washington, D.C., involving men whose corruption could destabilize territorial governments. "Here," he said, pointing to a section labeled Special Arrangements. "Look at this list of buyers. Ranch owners, mine operators, even some territorial officials. They weren't just buying labor, they were buying people." Elena felt sick as she read the clinical descriptions of human beings reduced to commodity listings. Children were priced by age and health status, women by their perceived attractiveness and domestic skills, men by their physical strength and work experience. The casual dehumanization of the entries made Morrison's brutality seem almost reasonable by comparison. "Miguel saw this," she said, her voice tight with controlled rage. This is what he was trying to document, not just Morrison's local crimes, but the entire system. Creek photographed key pages using a small camera he'd carried during his intelligence work, the flash powder carefully muffled to avoid detection. If they could get this evidence to honest federal authorities, it would provide enough documentation to bring down corruption networks in multiple territories. But as he worked, Creek noticed something troubling about the ledger's most recent entries. The date stopped abruptly 2 weeks ago, and the final notation was ominous: special audit scheduled. Clean house protocols initiated. H assumes operational control pending resolution. "Hartwell," Elena whispered, understanding the implications immediately. "Morrison's superiors knew he was becoming a liability, which means they planned his replacement before we ever killed him." Creek realized. Morrison wasn't just corrupt, he was expendable. They probably would have eliminated him themselves if we hadn't done it first. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. If Morrison's death had been anticipated, even planned, then Hartwell's mission wasn't just about cleaning up loose ends. It was about implementing a new, more secure system of operations. A sound from the street outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching the office building with the measured pace of men on patrol. Creek quickly closed the ledger and tucked it inside his shirt, then moved to the window to assess their situation. 3 of Hartwell's men were approaching the building, their rifles held ready but not aimed. They weren't responding to an alarm. This was a routine check, the kind of security sweep that professional soldiers conducted automatically. But routine or not, it meant Creek and Elena had perhaps 60 seconds to escape before being trapped inside. Creek gestured toward the back window, which opened onto an alley that connected to the maze of side streets behind Copperwell's main business district. He'd planned their escape route carefully during his reconnaissance, identifying multiple paths that would take them away from the building without exposing them to observation from the main street. Elena moved to the window first, climbing through with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to move silently during her desperate journey north. Creek followed, pausing only to ensure that the office showed no signs of their intrusion. Professional habits died hard, and leaving evidence of their presence would only make Hartwell's job easier. They dropped into the alley just as the front door to Morrison's office opened, the sound of boots on wooden floors, indicating that Hartwell's men were conducting a thorough search. Creek led Elena through a series of interconnected alleys and side streets, using shadows and building placement to mask their movement from anyone watching the main thoroughfares. "Did you get what we needed?" Elena whispered as they reached the edge of town and the relative safety of open desert. Creek patted the ledger concealed beneath his shirt. "More than we needed. This book contains enough evidence to destroy everyone involved in Morrison's network, from local ranch owners to federal senators." They moved quickly across the hardpan toward the rocky outcropping where they'd hidden their horses, both of them acutely aware that discovery would mean immediate pursuit by men who had no intention of taking prisoners. The territory stretched empty and hostile around them, offering concealment, but no real safety. "There's something else," Elena said as they reached their mounts. "While you were photographing the ledger, I noticed a map on Morrison's desk. It showed locations throughout the territory marked with different symbols, some in red, some in blue, some in black." Creek felt his pulse quicken. "Different types of operations?" "That's what I thought. The red marks were mostly along migration routes, places where families would naturally stop for water and rest. The blue marks were near mining and ranching operations that would need large numbers of workers. But the black marks—" Elena paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more fear than she'd shown even when facing Morrison's guns. "The black marks were near schools and churches, places where children gathered, and they were all dated within the next month." Creek felt ice settle in his stomach. If Elena was right, Morrison's operation had been evolving beyond opportunistic trafficking towards systematic targeting of specific communities. Children taken from schools and churches would be missed immediately, which meant the network had become confident enough to operate in broad daylight. Hartwell isn't just cleaning up Morrison's operation, Creek realized. He's expanding it. They rode in grim silence for the first hour, both lost in contemplation of the horror they'd uncovered. The ledger Creek carried represented years of carefully documented crimes, but it also revealed a system so pervasive and well-connected that bringing it down would require more than courage. It would require allies with the power to challenge corruption at the highest levels of territorial and federal government. The Apache woman, Ayana, Elena said, as they paused to rest their horses near a spring that reflected starlight like scattered diamonds. "Miguel told me she said something about the old ways, about how her people dealt with corruption that spread like poison through a community." Creek listened carefully, recognizing the tone that meant Elena was working through an important insight. She said that sometimes poison grew so strong that cutting out the infected parts wasn't enough. You had to burn the whole system and start fresh. But she also said that fire only cleansed if it was started by people with clean hands and pure hearts. Creek understood the metaphor. Ayana had been talking about revolution, not just the violent overthrow of corrupt systems, but the moral authority to rebuild something better in their place. It was a concept he'd wrestled with during the war, when fighting against Southern secession had required embracing methods that seemed to contradict the very values they were fighting to preserve. "Miguel's evidence," he said slowly. "It's not just proof of crimes. It's documentation of a system so corrupt that it can't be reformed, only replaced." Elena nodded. But replacing it means we have to survive long enough to get this information to people who can act on it. And Hartwell isn't going to let that happen if he can prevent it. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert from the direction of copper wells. Multiple riders, moving fast, following a trail that would inevitably lead to their current position. Hartwell had discovered their intrusion sooner than expected, and his response was characteristically swift and overwhelming. Creek counted the rhythm of approaching horses. 8 riders, maybe 10. They're pushing hard, but they're following our trail instead of trying to cut us off at known destinations. They don't know where we're going, which gives us an advantage, but not much of one. Hartwell's men are experienced trackers, and we're leaving signs that would be difficult to hide, even in daylight. Elena looked out across the vast landscape of mesas and canyons that stretched toward the border with Mexico. Somewhere in that wilderness lay the sacred caves where Miguel had hidden his drawings and observations, evidence that could complement Morrison's ledger and provide the complete picture needed to expose the entire trafficking network. How long to reach the first cave location? Creek consulted the Apache symbols Elena had shown him, comparing them to his mental map of the territory's hidden places. 6 hours of hard riding, assuming we don't encounter any more of Hartwell's patrols. But that's the most dangerous part of this entire operation. Once we're committed to searching the caves, we'll be trapped in a limited area with only a few escape routes. Elena turned her mother's ring on her finger, drawing strength from the connection to generations of women who'd faced impossible choices with quiet courage. Maria Vasquez had taught her that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger, it was about choosing which. Dangers were worth facing for the sake of something larger than personal safety. Miguel risked everything to leave us this evidence, she said. The least we can do is risk everything to find it. Creek studied her face in the starlight, seeing the resolution that reminded him so much of Sarah during their final conversation before he'd left for war. Some fights chose the people who would wage them, and some people were chosen specifically because they possessed the moral clarity to see those fights through to their conclusion. Then we ride hard and pray that Miguel's trust in Apache wisdom was justified, he said, mounting his horse and checking his weapons one final time. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder as Hartwell's men followed their trail across the desert floor. Ahead lay the sacred caves where a dying boy had hidden evidence that could bring justice to hundreds of victims and expose corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Between them and that goal stood 40 miles of hostile territory, professional killers who'd been paid to ensure their silence, and the growing certainty that this mission would end either in complete victory or total annihilation. There would be no middle ground for compromise. Elena touched Miguel's wooden cross one final time, then spurred her horse toward the distant mesas, where truth waited to be uncovered and justice demanded to be served. The federal marshal's credentials looked perfect. Brass badge polished to a mirror shine, official papers bearing the territorial seal, even a letter of introduction from the governor's office in Santa Fe. Marshal Thomas Whitfield had arrived in Creek's hidden valley under cover of darkness, claiming to be investigating reports of corruption in Sheriff Morrison's jurisdiction. Creek studied the documents by lamplight, while Elena watched from across the cabin, her dark eyes reflecting the wariness that had kept her alive during weeks of running from men who wore badges as licenses to kill. Something about the marshal's arrival felt wrong, though Creek couldn't immediately identify what was triggering his combat instincts. "I received word of Morrison's death through official channels," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to being believed without question. "Also received reports that a Mexican woman with information about trafficking operations was being hunted by unknown parties. Took me some time to track you down to this location." The marshal was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested years of frontier service. His gun wore the smooth patina of constant use, and his movements carried the confidence of someone who'd survived numerous dangerous encounters. Everything about him suggested legitimate federal authority, but Elena had learned to distrust men who appeared exactly as they claimed to be. "How did you find us?" she asked quietly. Whitfield smiled, the expression friendly but somehow not reaching his eyes. "Miss, I've been tracking fugitives and outlaws through this territory for 15 years. A mountain man and a refugee girl leave signs that an experienced tracker can follow, even when they're trying to stay hidden." Creek returned the credentials, noting that Whitfield's fingers were soft despite his claims of frontier experience. Small detail, but one that suggested more time behind desks than in saddles. "What exactly are you investigating, Marshal?" "Reports of systematic corruption involving human trafficking, illegal detention of border crossers, and possible federal involvement in territorial crime networks." Whitfield moved to Creek's maps, studying the marked locations with professional interest. "I understand you've recovered documentation that could support these allegations." Elena felt alarm bells ringing in her mind. She hadn't mentioned Morrison's ledger to anyone except Creek, and they'd been careful to avoid discussing their discoveries where others might overhear. How could a legitimate federal marshal know about documentation they'd only recovered 2 days ago? "What kind of documentation?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, while her hand moved casually toward the knife Creek had given her. Whitfield's eyes flicked to her movement, and for just an instant, Elena saw something cold and calculating behind his friendly facade. "The usual items in cases like this: financial records, correspondence, lists of contacts. The kind of evidence that helps federal prosecutors build comprehensive cases against criminal networks." Creek felt his military instincts sharpening. Whitfield was fishing for information, describing the type of evidence any investigator would hope to find, rather than demonstrating specific knowledge of what they'd actually recovered. It was a technique Creek had seen Confederate spies use during the war, appearing helpful while actually gathering intelligence. "I'm curious, Marshal," Creek said carefully. "How exactly did federal authorities learn about Morrison's trafficking operation? These activities have been going on for years, according to what we've uncovered." Whitfield's smile became slightly strained. "Federal law enforcement receives reports from many sources: other territorial officials, concerned citizens, even reformed criminals seeking to reduce their own sentences." Elena caught the subtle change in his tone and realized what had been bothering her about the marshal's arrival. A legitimate federal investigator would have brought backup, especially when pursuing a case involving organized crime and potential violence. But Whitfield had come alone, claiming to be investigating a major corruption network without any visible support. "Where's your deputy, Marshal?" she asked pointedly. "Working other leads in Santa Fe. Federal marshals often operate independently when gathering preliminary intelligence." Creek moved casually to his rifle, noting how Whitfield's hand drifted toward his gun in response. The marshal might be carrying legitimate credentials, but his instincts were those of a man expecting trouble rather than cooperation. "You know what troubles me about your story, Marshal?" Creek said, his voice taking on the flat tone that Elena had learned meant he was preparing for violence. "You claim to be investigating Morrison's operation, but you arrived awfully quickly after his death, almost like you were already in the territory." Whitfield's friendly facade finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation that Elena had glimpsed earlier. "Mr. Creek, I think you're allowing justified paranoia to cloud your judgment. I'm here to help, not to threaten you." "Then you won't mind if we verify your credentials through official channels," Elena said, pulling Miguel's wooden cross from her pocket and holding it like a talisman. "We can send word to Santa Fe, confirm your identity and mission." The marshal's laugh held no humor. "I'm afraid there isn't time for lengthy verification procedures. Colonel Hartwell is closing in on this location, and we need to move quickly if we're going to preserve the evidence you've recovered." Creek felt ice settle in his stomach. Legitimate federal marshals didn't typically know the names and operational details of men like Hartwell, unless they were working with them. How do you know about Hartwell? Creek asked quietly. Whitfield realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to recall the words. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, revealing the predatory intelligence that Elena had sensed from the beginning. Because Mr. Creek, Colonel Hartwell and I are old friends. We've worked together on several similar operations, cleaning up messes that threaten important people's interests. Elena felt the world shift around her as understanding crashed over her like a physical blow. The federal marshal wasn't investigating Morrison's corruption, he was part of it. Whitfield represented the federal connections that had protected Morrison's operation. And now he was here to eliminate the evidence that could expose the entire network. Creek's hand closed around his rifle as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Whitfield's arrival, his knowledge of their activities, his pressure to move quickly, it all made sense if the marshal was actually working to protect the trafficking network rather than expose it. The credentials, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're real, aren't they? You really are a federal marshal, Whitfield nodded, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful facade. Appointed by men who understand that certain types of law enforcement require certain types of flexibility. Morrison's operation generated substantial revenue for important people, Miss Vasquez. Your brother's interference and your survival have created complications that need to be resolved. Creek felt rage building in his chest. The same fury that had driven him through 3 years of war against men who used legitimate authority to justify illegitimate brutality. A corrupt sheriff was one thing. Corrupt federal officials represented a betrayal of everything he'd fought to preserve. So you're here to kill us and recover Morrison's ledger, Creek said, his voice deadly calm. I'm here to resolve a situation that threatens national security interests, Whitfield corrected. The trafficking network you've stumbled onto isn't just about moving desperate families. It's about maintaining stability in territories that are crucial to American expansion. Sometimes maintaining that stability requires overlooking certain irregularities. Elena stared at the man who represented everything her family had hoped to escape by coming to America. The casual way he dismissed human suffering as irregularities, the comfortable manner in which he justified slavery as national security, it was the same mentality that had driven the men who burned her village and killed her. Father, Miguel was right, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. The corruption does go all the way to the top. You're not here to enforce the law. You're here to protect criminals who wear badges. Whitfield drew his gun with the smooth efficiency of a professional killer, though he kept it pointed at the floor, rather than directly threatening them. Miss Vasquez, your brother was an intelligent boy, but intelligence without wisdom can be dangerous. He documented things that certain people prefer to keep private. Creek measured the distance between himself and his rifle, calculating angles and timing with the precision of a man who'd survived similar situations during the war. Whitfield was good, professional, experienced, confident, but he'd made the mistake of assuming that an aging mountain man and a young Mexican woman would be easily intimidated. What happens now? Creek asked. Now you give me Morrison's ledger and any other evidence you've recovered. In return, I ensure that your deaths appear to be the result of an unfortunate encounter with bandits. Quick, clean, with no unnecessary suffering. Elena felt Miguel's presence as strongly as if her brother were standing beside her. All his courage, all his determination to document the truth even while dying. It would mean nothing if she allowed Whitfield to destroy the evidence and silence the witnesses. And if we refuse? Whitfield's smile was genuinely sympathetic. Then Colonel Hartwell and his men arrived to find a tragic scene. 2 fugitives who chose to resist federal authority and paid the ultimate price for their defiance. Either way, the evidence disappears and the network continues to operate. Creek met Elena's eyes across the cabin, seeing the same resolve that had driven her to save refugee children and her brother to document unspeakable crimes. They'd come too far and sacrificed too much to surrender now. Regardless of the odds, there's a third option, Creek said quietly. I'm listening. Creek's rifle came up in a smooth, practice motion, while Elena dove for cover behind the heavy wooden table. Whitfield was fast, professional training evident in the speed of his response. But Creek had 3 years of combat experience and 15 years of controlled anger fueling his movements. The gunfight that followed was brief and vicious. Whitfield was skilled, but he'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating opponents who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. When the smoke cleared, the corrupt federal marshal lay dead on the cabin floor, his perfect credentials scattered like worthless paper. Elena emerged from cover, her face pale but determined. How many more of them are there? How many other federal officials are involved in this? Creek examined Whitfield's personal effects, finding additional documents that painted an even more disturbing picture of corruption. Orders signed by territorial governors, correspondence with military suppliers, even letters bearing congressional seals. The trafficking network reached far deeper into American government than either of them had imagined. Enough to ensure that normal channels won't help us, Creek said grimly. If we're going to expose this network, we'll have to do it ourselves. And we'll have to do it in a way that forces honest officials to act. Elena looked down at Whitfield's body, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Justice had been served, but at the cost of any hope that legitimate federal authority might help them. They were truly on their own now, facing enemies who could invoke the power of the United States government to justify their crimes. Miguel's evidence, she said. It's more important now than ever. If corrupt federal marshals are part of this network, we need proof that's so overwhelming that honest officials can't ignore it. Creek nodded, already planning their next moves. Whitfield's death would bring Hartwell and his men within hours, but it would also force the network's leaders to make desperate choices. Corrupt systems could survive exposure of individual criminals, but they couldn't survive proof of systematic federal involvement. We find Miguel's caves, he said. We recover every piece of evidence he left, and then we make sure the whole world knows what we found. Elena touched her brother's wooden cross, drawing strength from the connection to his courage and determination. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of approaching riders, Hartwell's men, coming to finish what Whitfield had failed to complete. But now they knew the true scope of their enemy, and they knew that compromise was impossible. This had become a war between truth and power, between justice and corruption, between the America that Miguel had died believing in and the America that men like Whitfield represented. It was a war they intended to win. Creek's father's cavalry saber lay across his knees as he sat cleaning the blade with methodical precision. The weapon had belonged to 3 generations of Creek men, his great-grandfather at Valley Forge, his grandfather fighting British forces in 1812, his father leading Union cavalry at Bull Run. Each man had carried it into battle, believing he was fighting for principles that mattered more than personal survival. Now it would serve the same purpose again. Your father was a soldier too, Elena observed, watching Creek work the oil into the steel with movements that spoke of long familiarity with the ritual. Captain William Creek, Pennsylvania 3rd Cavalry, died at Sharpsburg, leading a charge against Confederate artillery. Creek held the saber up to catch the lamplight, checking the edge with professional attention. He taught me that some fights choose you, and when they do, you meet them with honor, or you live the rest of your life knowing you failed when it mattered most. Elena understood the weight of inherited responsibility. Her own family had passed down stories of ancestors who'd fought against Spanish colonizers, Mexican revolutionaries, and American expansionists, always choosing conscience over convenience, even when conscience demanded terrible sacrifices. Through the cabin's small window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern mountains. They'd spent the night planning their final assault on the cave system where Miguel had hidden his evidence, knowing that success would either vindicate his courage or ensure that all of them died together in pursuit of justice. Creek stood and strapped the saber to his belt alongside his modern weapons. The symbolic weight felt right, connecting his present fight to the long tradition of men who'd chosen principle over profit, truth over comfort. Hartwell will bring his full force once he discovers Whitfield's body, Creek said, moving to the detailed maps they'd spread across the cabin floor. 12 experienced killers, all of them Confederate veterans who've spent the last 15 years learning how to fight dirty wars for dirty causes. Elena studied the tactical markings Creek had made during their planning session. Red circles marked known approach routes. Blue squares indicated defensive positions. Black triangles showed escape paths through terrain too dangerous for mounted pursuit. It was the work of a military mind that understood how to turn disadvantage into opportunity. "You're talking about making a stand," she said. "I'm talking about choosing the battlefield. Hartwell expects us to keep running, to stay defensive while he uses superior numbers and resources to wear us down. But running only works if you have somewhere to run to." Creek traced a route through the canyon system that led to the sacred caves, his finger following paths that would be treacherous even for experienced climbers. "The Apache symbols your brother copied. They don't just indicate hiding places. They describe a fortress." Elena leaned closer, beginning to understand Creek's strategy. "The caves aren't just storage sites, they're defensible positions. Better than that. According to these markings, they're part of a network that connects through underground passages. Someone who knew the routes could move between positions without being seen, appear where enemies least expected them." Creek pulled out his signal mirror and began adjusting its angle to catch the early morning light. Outside, Tom Brennan would be watching from his distant trading post, ready to relay messages that could coordinate their final gambit against Hartwell's forces. "What are you telling him?" "That we're going to need every honest man in this territory to know what we've found, regardless of whether we survive to tell them ourselves." Creek sent a series of coded flashes toward the distant peak where Brennan maintained his observation post. "Tom has contacts among miners, ranchers, even some territorial officials who aren't part of the corruption network. If we can get them the evidence, they can finish what we started," Elena realized. The answering flashes came quickly, Brennan's response indicating understanding and agreement. "Whatever happened in the coming confrontation, the truth about Morrison's network would survive even if its discoverers didn't." Elena moved to her own preparations, checking the weapons Creek had taught her to use and reviewing the cave locations one final time. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a frightened refugee girl chained to a rock, waiting to die for the crime of seeking safety. Now she was a soldier preparing for battle in pursuit of justice for hundreds of victims. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of confession. "About Miguel's final instructions." Creek looked up from his equipment check, recognizing the tone that meant Elena was about to share something crucial. "Before he died, Miguel made me promise something. He said if anything happened to him, I should find someone brave enough to follow his trail to the end, even if it meant going to war against people who wore badges and claimed legal authority." Elena pulled Miguel's wooden cross from her pocket, but this time she held it differently, and Creek realized it wasn't just a memorial token. It was a key. "The cross comes apart," she said, twisting the base to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small piece of paper covered with Miguel's careful handwriting. "These are the real locations, the complete set of directions to every cache he made. Everything else, the conversations with Ayana, the Apache symbols, those were misdirection in case we were captured." Creek felt a chill of admiration for the dead boy's tactical thinking. Even while dying, Miguel had planned for contingencies, creating false trails and real ones, ensuring that only someone who truly understood his sister would be able to find his evidence. "He knew this would happen," Creek said. "He knew you'd need to find someone willing to fight this war with you." Miguel said the evidence he'd gathered was enough to bring down the entire network, but only if it reached the right people in the right way. Random accusations could be dismissed or covered up, but systematic documentation presented publicly would force honest officials to act even if it exposed their own colleagues. Creek finished. Your brother was thinking like a chess player, planning several moves ahead. Elena nodded, tears threatening as she remembered Miguel's final lucid moments. He said America was supposed to be different from the places we fled, but that the difference wasn't automatic. It had to be fought for by people who believed in what it could become, rather than accepting what it had become. Creek strapped on his weapons and gathered his field pack. The familiar weight of military equipment bringing back memories of other battles fought for similar principles. The tools were the same: rifle, sidearm, blade, tactical knowledge, but the stakes felt higher than anything he'd faced during the war. "Elena," he said, turning to face her directly, "what we're about to do, it's not just dangerous, it's likely suicidal. Hartwell has us outnumbered, outgunned, and he's got federal backing for whatever actions he takes. Even if we succeed in exposing the network, we might not live to see justice served." Elena met his grey eyes steadily, her dark gaze holding the same fierce determination that had sustained her through weeks of running and fighting. "Miguel died believing that truth was worth more than life. I won't dishonor his memory by choosing safety over justice when the moment of decision comes." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert, Hartwell's forces finally converging on the hidden valley where their quarry had made their stand. Greek counted the rhythm, confirming his estimate of 12 riders moving in tactical formation. "They're here," he said simply. Elena touched her mother's ring one final time, drawing strength from the connection to generations of women who'd faced impossible odds with quiet courage. Then she picked up her rifle and moved to the window, her movements showing the training Creek had given her during their weeks together. "Miguel left one more message," she said, reading from the paper hidden in the cross. "He said that if someone was brave enough to follow his trail to the end, they should know that the caves hold more than just evidence. They hold hope. The proof that ordinary people can document extraordinary crimes. That truth has power even when spoken by the powerless." Creek felt a surge of pride for the boy he'd never met, recognizing in Miguel the same moral clarity that had driven men like his father to charge Confederate artillery despite impossible odds. Some principles were worth dying for because they were the only things that made life worth living. "Then let's go recover that hope," he said, shouldering his pack and heading for the door. "And let's make sure Miguel's courage wasn't wasted." Elena followed, her own equipment ready and her resolve absolute. Behind them, they left the cabin where they'd planned their war against corruption and prepared their assault on injustice. Ahead lay the sacred caves where a dying boy had hidden, evidence that could topple criminal networks and restore faith in American justice. Between them and that goal stood 12 professional killers who represented everything wrong with a system that protected the powerful by destroying the innocent. But Elena and Creek were no longer running from that system. They were attacking it with the weapons Miguel had provided and the courage his sacrifice had inspired. As they moved through the early morning shadows toward their final confrontation, Creek's father's saber caught the rising sun, reflecting light like a beacon of hope in a landscape that had seen too much suffering and too little justice. The war for truth was about to begin in earnest. The sacred canyon stretched before them like a cathedral, carved from red stone, its walls rising 300 feet into the desert sky. Ancient peoples had chosen this place for the same reasons Miguel had: the acoustic properties that made whispers carry clearly while muffling sounds from outside, the defensive advantages of limited access points, and the spiritual power that came from being surrounded by eternal stone, marked with the stories of generations. Elena felt her brother's presence strongly as they approached the first cave entrance, following the true directions hidden in Miguel's wooden cross. The symbols carved into the rock face weren't random markings. They were a language of protection and remembrance that spoke to anyone who understood that some truths were too important to lose. Creek moved with the tactical awareness of a soldier entering enemy territory, his weathered hands checking his weapons one final time before they committed to the narrow canyon where retreat would be impossible. Behind them, Hartwell's forces had spread into a systematic search pattern, following the false trails Elena and Creek had laid during their approach. But the canyon's acoustic properties that made it perfect for hiding also made it perfect for ambush. Every sound echoed and amplified, turning footsteps into thunderclaps and voices into announcements that could be heard for miles. "They're coming," Elena whispered, pointing to dust clouds rising from 3 different approach routes. Hartwell had divided his forces, sending smaller teams through multiple canyons to prevent escape while maintaining enough concentrated firepower to overwhelm any resistance. Creek studied the tactical situation with the cool assessment that had kept him alive through 3 years of war. Hartwell's strategy was sound: divide and conquer, use superior numbers to force a quick resolution. But it relied on facing opponents who thought defensively, who would try to hide or flee rather than attack. "How long do we have?" Elena asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30. They're being careful, checking for traps and ambush positions. Creek moved to the cave entrance and examined the ancient symbols more closely. But they don't know what they're walking into. The first cave contained exactly what Miguel's directions had promised. Not just evidence, but a complete archive of Morrison's trafficking operation, documented with the precision of a dying boy who understood that details would matter more than accusations. Drawings, names, dates, routes, even sketches of the brands used to mark victims like livestock, everything organized with care that spoke to Miguel's determination to be believed. But more importantly, the cave system connected to others through passages that ancient peoples had used for ceremonies and defense. Elena and Creek weren't trapped in a dead end. They were positioned in a fortress that had protected truth-tellers for centuries. The sound of approaching voices echoed off the canyon walls, distorted by the stone into something that sounded like distant thunder. Hartwell's men were closer than expected, their search patterns more efficient than Creek had hoped. "There," Elena said, pointing to a narrow passage that led deeper into the rock. Miguel's directions indicated that the tunnel connected to observation points overlooking the main canyon floor, perfect positions for the kind of asymmetric warfare that had made Creek legendary. During his military service, they moved through the ancient passages with reverence, aware that they were following paths sacred to peoples who'd understood that some places held power that transcended individual ownership. The walls bore paintings that told stories of courage and sacrifice, of truth-tellers who'd faced down darkness with nothing but their determination to preserve what mattered. Creek reached the first observation point and studied the canyon floor below. Through a natural window in the stone, Hartwell's men were advancing in professional formation, checking every shadow and crevice with the thoroughness of experienced soldiers. But they were looking for hiding places, not fighting positions. "Colonel Hartwell," Elena called, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon's acoustic chambers. "We know who you are, and we know who sent you." The response was immediate, rifles swinging toward the sound, men taking cover behind boulders and rocky outcroppings. But the canyon's echoes made it impossible to pinpoint the source, and Elena had already moved to a different position. "Miss Vasquez," Hartwell's voice responded, amplified by the stone until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. We only want the evidence you've stolen. Give us Morrison's ledger and your brother's materials, and we can resolve this peacefully." Creek moved to his own position, sighting down his rifle at targets who thought they were hidden but were clearly visible from his elevated vantage point. Military training had taught him to use terrain advantages ruthlessly, and the sacred canyon provided better fields of fire than any fort he'd defended during the war, peaceful like you resolved it with Marshal Whitfield. Elena called back, "Peaceful like Morrison resolved it with Mexican families who couldn't pay his bribes?" Hartwell's laugh echoed off the canyon walls, cold and without humor. "Miss Vasquez, you fundamentally misunderstand the situation. Marshal Whitfield died because he tried to reason with terrorists who'd already chosen violence over cooperation. Don't make the same mistake he did. The casual way Hartwell dismissed Whitfield's death and Elena's potential. Murder, as reasonable responses to terrorism, crystallized everything wrong with the system they were fighting. These men used badges and federal authority to legitimize brutality, wrapping their crimes in language of national security and law enforcement. Elena, Creek called softly, his voice carrying through passages that connected their positions. Time to show them what Miguel documented. Elena began reading from her brother's careful notes, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon's acoustic chambers. Names, dates, amounts, specific details that painted a picture of systematic corruption involving territorial officials, federal marshals, and politicians whose careers would be destroyed by public exposure. Senator Patterson, $5,000 for consultation on border security policies, she read. Governor Martinez, $3,000 for territorial appointment considerations. Marshal Davidson, $2,000 for investigation delays and evidence disposal. Each name hit Hartwell's forces like a physical blow. These weren't random accusations. They were documented facts that could be verified through public records and financial investigations. Miguel had built a case that would survive in court, even if his sister didn't survive to present it. Creek watched. Hartwell's tactical formation began to falter as individual men realized they were fighting to protect corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Some of these mercenaries might be willing to kill for money, but few would want to be connected to treason when the evidence became public. Hartwell, Creek called, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops in battle. Your men deserve to know what they're really fighting for. Not law enforcement, conspiracy to commit treason against the United States government. The canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind through stone passages. Creek could see Hartwell's forces shifting restlessly, professional soldiers beginning to question orders that seemed designed to protect criminals rather than serve justice. Then Hartwell's voice cut through the silence, sharp with desperation and rage. Kill them both. Whatever it takes, wherever they're hiding, burn them out if necessary. This ends now. The first shots rang out like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting the canyon walls as Hartwell's men opened fire on positions they couldn't clearly see. But Creek and Elena were already moving through the connected passages, using ancient knowledge to appear in unexpected places and disappear before return fire could find them. Creek's first shot dropped one of Hartwell's men from a position the mercenary thought was secure. His second and third found targets who'd made the mistake of assuming their elevated positions gave them safety rather than exposure. Elena's rifle barked from a different angle, her aim true despite her relatively recent training. She'd learned to shoot the way she'd learned everything else during their weeks together, with focus born from necessity and determination, powered by love for a dead brother who'd trusted her to finish what he'd started, the sacred canyon that had protected truth-tellers for centuries was about to witness its greatest test, a battle between those who served justice and those who served only themselves. Elena emerged from the ancient passage with Miguel's complete archive in her hands. Drawings, documentation, witness statements, everything her brother had died to preserve. The sacred cave had protected his evidence perfectly, keeping truth safe until someone brave enough to claim it could carry it into the light. But the battle for that truth was far from over. Colonel Hartwell stood 30 yards away on the canyon floor, his remaining men spread in defensive positions among the rocks. 3 of his mercenaries lay dead, victims of Creek's precision shooting and Elena's determined resistance. The others showed the nervous tension of professional soldiers who discovered they were fighting for causes they couldn't defend with honor. "Miss Vasquez," Hartwell called, his voice carrying clearly in the cathedral silence of the canyon. "You're holding documentation of a federal investigation into territorial corruption. By interfering with that investigation, you're committing treason against the United States government." Elena felt laughter bubble up in her throat, but it came out as something darker, the sound of someone who'd seen too much corruption disguised as patriotism to be impressed by official threats. "Federal investigation," she repeated, her voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. Is that what you call selling children to mine owners and ranch operators? Is that how federal marshals investigate crime? By participating in it? Hartwell's face flushed with anger, but Elena could see uncertainty in his eyes. His authority had always depended on intimidating people who believed in the system he claimed to represent. Facing someone who'd lost faith in that system entirely had left him without his most effective weapon. You witnessed crimes, Hartwell said, trying a different approach. Crimes that federal authorities are working to address through proper channels. But vigilante justice and stolen evidence won't help the victims you claim to care about. Elena looked down at Miguel's carefully preserved drawings. Faces of children they'd tried to save. Sketches of wagons loaded with human cargo. Maps showing routes that Morrison's network had used to transport victims across territorial boundaries. Her brother had documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that details would matter more than accusations. Miguel didn't steal evidence, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. He created it. He was the witness, the investigator, the one who cared enough to document what everyone else ignored. Creek's voice echoed from somewhere in the canyon heights, though his position remained invisible to Hartwell's men. Colonel, your federal authority extends to investigating crimes, not committing them. Everything in Miguel's archive documents federal officials participating in human trafficking operations. Creek, Hartwell responded, scanning the canyon walls for signs of the mountain man's location. You're a decorated veteran. You understand the importance of supporting legitimate authority, even when individual cases seem questionable. Elena heard something in Hartwell's tone that reminded her of Morrison's casual dismissal of human suffering as necessary for larger purposes. Men like Hartwell had learned to use patriotism and duty as shields for brutality, wrapping their crimes in language that made resistance seem unpatriotic. Miguel believed in legitimate authority, she said, pulling out one of her brother's most damning drawings, a detailed sketch of Morrison meeting with uniformed federal marshals to discuss pricing for different categories of victims. That's why he documented the difference between what authority claimed to be and what it actually was. Hartwell studied the drawing, his face revealing recognition of the figures Miguel had captured so precisely. These weren't generic accusations. They were specific, verifiable documentation of federal officials participating in criminal enterprises. Where's the rest of it? Hartwell demanded. Morrison's ledger, financial records, correspondence with territorial officials, everything you stole from his office. Elena smiled, understanding that Hartwell's desperation came from knowing exactly how much evidence existed and how damaging it would be if it reached honest authorities. You mean the documentation that's already been copied and distributed to newspaper editors in 3 territories? The lie came smoothly, but Hartwell's reaction suggested it might become truth sooner than expected. His face went pale, and she could see him calculating the political and legal consequences of widespread exposure. You're bluffing. Tom Brennan's trading post has signal mirror communication with settlements throughout this territory. Creek's voice added from the canyon heights. Messages travel faster than riders when people know how to use them. Elena watched Hartwell's remaining men exchange glances. Professional soldiers beginning to understand that they'd become liabilities to the very people who'd hired them. Men involved in treason rarely left witnesses alive, even witnesses who'd been working on their behalf. Colonel, one of the mercenaries called. Maybe we should consider Hartwell's pistol shot cut off the suggestion, dropping the man who dared to question orders. The remaining mercenaries took cover immediately, but Elena could see them eyeing their leader with new wariness. Anyone else have suggestions about how to handle this situation? Hartwell asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who'd maintained control through calculated brutality. Elena felt Miguel's presence strongly as she stepped into full view on the canyon floor, no longer hiding behind rocks or seeking protection in the ancient passages. Her brother had faced death with courage because he'd believed truth was worth more than life. She wouldn't dishonor his memory by hiding when the moment of decision arrived. "I have a suggestion," she said, Miguel's archive held openly in her hands. "You could try telling the truth for once in your life." Hartwell's laugh held no humor. "Miss Vasquez, truth is a luxury that people in my position can't afford. Truth gets in the way of necessary decisions. Necessary for who? The territorial officials who profit from selling people? The federal marshals who split the proceeds? The politicians who get rich while families disappear into slavery?" Elena began reading again from Miguel's documentation, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon's acoustic chambers. But this time she wasn't just presenting evidence, she was telling stories. Personal accounts of families destroyed, children separated from parents, desperate people betrayed by the very officials who claimed to protect them. Maria Santos, age 7, sold to a mine operator in Colorado Territory for $40. Her parents were told she died of fever during detention. Carlos Mendez, age 15, transported to a ranch in New Mexico Territory where he was beaten to death for trying to escape. The ranch owner was told he was a convicted criminal, being served the remainder of his sentence through labor assignment. Each story hit Hartwell's remaining men like physical blows. These weren't abstract crimes. They were specific acts of cruelty committed against real people whose only offense had been seeking safety in America. Creek's voice joined Elena's, reading from Morrison's ledger with the flat precision of a military report. Senator Patterson, New Mexico Territory, received $3,000 in consultation fees for supporting legislation that reduced federal oversight of territorial law enforcement. Governor Martinez, Arizona Territory, received $5,000 for appointing territorial marshals who would cooperate with special enforcement arrangements. The systematic nature of the corruption became clear as Creek and Elena read alternating entries, a network that reached from local sheriffs to federal senators, all of them profiting from human misery while claiming to serve American justice. Hartwell raised his pistol toward Elena, his face twisted with desperate rage. "Enough! This ends now!" But Creek's rifle spoke first, the shot echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Hartwell spun and fell, his weapon clattering across the stone floor of the ancient cathedral, where truth-tellers had sought sanctuary for generations. Elena stood motionless for a moment, Miguel's archive still clutched in her hands, watching as the man who'd represented everything corrupt about American authority lay dying among the sacred stones. She felt no satisfaction in his death, only the hollow completion of a task that had demanded too much from too many people. The remaining mercenaries lowered their weapons, the fight gone out of them with their leader's fall. Professional soldiers recognized defeat when they saw it, and they also recognized that continuing to fight would only make them accessories to crimes they'd never fully understood. "Miss," one of them called. A grizzled sergeant who'd clearly seen too many wars fought for questionable causes. "We surrender." "This wasn't what we signed up for." Elena studied their faces, seeing confusion and shame rather than hostility. These men had been told they were hunting terrorists and fugitives, not fighting to protect a network that sold children into slavery. "What were you told about this mission?" she asked. The sergeant looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. "Federal marshals tracking dangerous fugitives who'd killed law enforcement officers and stolen evidence from a federal investigation. We were told you were Mexican revolutionaries trying to destabilize territorial governments." Elena felt a surge of understanding. Hartwell's men hadn't been fighting to protect corruption. They'd been fighting because they'd been lied to, manipulated into serving causes they would never have supported if they'd known the truth. "Sergeant," Creek's voice called from the canyon heights, "your Colonel Hartwell was part of a network that trafficked Mexican families like livestock. The evidence Miss Vasquez carries documents federal officials selling children to mine owners and ranch operators." The sergeant's face went pale as understanding crashed over him. "Jesus! We've been hunting the witnesses, not the criminals." Elena moved closer, letting the mercenaries see Miguel's drawings and documentation clearly. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed sketches of trafficking operations, careful documentation of official corruption, witness statements from families whose children had disappeared into Hartwell's network. My brother Miguel documented everything because he believed Americans would care about justice if they knew the truth. He died trying to preserve evidence that could save other families from what happened to us. The sergeant studied Miguel's drawings with growing horror, recognizing the systematic nature of the crimes they revealed. How many children? Hundreds. Over the years, Morrison's network operated. Maybe thousands when you count all the territories involved. Elena's voice carried the weight of accumulated grief. Every family that crossed the border, desperate enough to risk everything for their children's safety. One of the younger mercenaries stepped forward, his face showing the same sick understanding that had overcome his sergeant. "Ma'am, if we'd known, you'd have done what? Refused the mission?" Reported Hartwell to federal authorities who were part of the network. Elena's tone wasn't accusatory. She was genuinely curious about how good men became complicit in evil systems. "We'd have found a way to do the right thing," the sergeant said firmly. "Soldiers have a duty to refuse illegal orders, even from federal authorities." Creek emerged from the canyon passages, his rifle still ready but no longer threatening. He studied the mercenaries with the tactical assessment of a man who'd learned to distinguish between enemies and misguided allies. "Sergeant, you and your men have a choice now," Creek said. "You can ride back to whoever hired you and report that you eliminated the witnesses and recovered the evidence. Or you can help us ensure this documentation reaches authorities who'll actually act on it." The sergeant looked at his remaining men, reading their expressions with the experience of someone who'd led soldiers through moral challenges before. "What do you need from us?" Elena felt tears threaten, not tears of grief, but of hope. Miguel had believed that truth would find allies if it was presented clearly and courageously, even among men who'd been fighting against them. Honor could overcome deception when facts replaced lies. "Help us get this evidence to newspaper editors, territorial judges, federal investigators who aren't part of the corruption network," Elena said. Miguel died believing that Americans would demand justice if they knew what was being done in their name. The sergeant nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I've got contacts throughout the territorial government. Honest men who joined federal service to serve their country, not line their pockets. They'll want to see this documentation." Creek studied the tactical situation with satisfaction. Hartwell's death and the conversion of his mercenaries had transformed their desperate last stand into a victory that could accomplish Miguel's original goal, exposing corruption so systematically that honest officials would be forced to act. "There's more," Elena said, pulling additional documents from Miguel's archive. Names, locations, financial records, everything needed to trace this network back to its sources and forward to its customers. She handed the sergeant one of Miguel's most detailed drawings, a map showing trafficking routes that connected multiple territories, with notations indicating which officials had been bribed to allow safe passage through their jurisdictions. "This isn't just about Arizona territory," the sergeant realized. "This network spans half the American West, which means closing it down will require federal action on a scale that local authorities can't ignore or cover up," Creek added. "Miguel's evidence isn't just documentation of crimes, it's proof of conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of territorial government." Elena looked around the sacred canyon where her brother's courage had finally found the allies it deserved. Ancient stone walls bore the paintings of other truth-tellers who'd preserved important knowledge for future generations. Miguel's archive would join that tradition, evidence preserved not in stone, but in the hearts and minds of people who understood that some truths were too important to let die. "Miguel always said that America was supposed to be different," she said softly. "Not perfect, but willing to face its imperfections and do better. He died believing that truth had power here, even when spoken by powerless people." The sergeant carefully folded Miguel's map and tucked it inside his shirt. "Miss, your brother was right. But truth needs allies to turn it into justice. You've got them now, As the sun reached its zenith above the sacred canyon, Elena felt Miguel's presence one final time, not the desperate, dying boy who'd hidden evidence in ancient caves, but the hopeful young man who'd believed that courage and truth could overcome any corruption. His faith had been justified. Justice would finally be served. 6 months after the battle in the sacred canyon, Elena stood before the newly established Territorial Justice Commission in Phoenix, holding a document that would have seemed impossible during those dark weeks when she'd been chained to a desert rock, waiting to die for the crime of seeking safety in America. The paper bore official seals and signatures that carried the weight of federal authority, but this time, authority that served justice rather than corruption. It was a charter for the Vasquez settlement, a new community where families could find genuine safety, honest work, and the protection of laws that applied equally to everyone, regardless of their origin or their ability to pay bribes. "Miss Vasquez," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the respect due to someone who'd risked everything to expose systematic corruption. "This commission exists because your brother's courage and your determination proved that ordinary citizens could document extraordinary crimes. We're honored to approve this charter." Eleanor accepted the document with hands that no longer shook, though she still carried the small scars left by Morrison's chains. 6 months of congressional investigations, federal trials, and territorial reform had transformed her from a hunted refugee into a woman whose testimony had toppled criminal networks reaching from Arizona to Washington, D.C. But the victory had come at a price that still ached in quiet moments. Creek stood beside her, his weathered face showing the contentment of a man who'd finally found worthy use for skills he'd hoped never to need again. His shoulder bore fresh scars from their final battle, but his grey eyes held peace rather than the haunted shadows that had driven him into 15 years of mountain solitude. "Samuel," Elena said softly, using his given name, as she'd learned to do during the months they'd spent testifying before various federal commissions. "Miguel would be proud to see this," Creek nodded, thinking of the boy he'd never met, but whose courage had changed both their lives in ways that still amazed him. Miguel's archive had become the foundation for the largest federal investigation of territorial corruption in American history, leading to the arrest of 12 federal marshals, 6 territorial governors, and 3 United States senators. But more importantly, it had led to this: a community where the principles Miguel had died believing in could be lived rather than just honored in speeches. Elena touched her mother's ring, which now shared her finger with a simpler band that Creek had placed there 3 months ago during a ceremony conducted by Judge Harrison himself. The marriage had surprised some people who'd followed their story in the newspapers, but anyone who'd seen them together understood that their love had grown from shared purpose rather than convenience or sentiment. "There's something I need to show you," Elena said, pulling a worn piece of paper from her dress pocket. It was a letter that had arrived 2 weeks ago, forwarded through several territorial mail services until it finally reached the woman whose name had become synonymous with justice for trafficking victims. Creek read over her shoulder, his expression growing more amazed with each paragraph. The letter was from a Catholic mission in New Mexico Territory, signed by a priest who'd been following the congressional investigations with intense personal interest. 6 children, Creek said softly. 6 children who'd been sold into labor arrangements that were dissolved when the federal investigations exposed the network. "They're alive, Elena. The children you and Miguel saved that night, they're alive and asking to join your settlement." Elena felt tears flowing freely, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. For months, she'd wondered whether their sacrifices had been worth the cost, whether exposing corruption would actually help the victims who'd suffered under Morrison's system. Now she had her answer. "Maria Santos," she read aloud. The 7-year-old girl Miguel drew so carefully. "She's 9 now, learning to read and write at the mission school. Father Martinez says she asks about the brave woman who helped save her from the mining camps." Creek wrapped his arms around Elena. both of them overwhelmed by the realization that Miguel's courage had accomplished exactly what he'd hoped, not just justice for past crimes, but protection for future victims. The Vasquez settlement had grown from an idea into a reality that exceeded their most optimistic dreams. 43 families now lived in houses built with honest labor and protected by laws that applied equally to everyone. The community included not just Mexican refugees, but also former soldiers like Creek, who'd found purpose in building something positive rather than just fighting against what was wrong. Elena had kept Miguel's promise to their mother in ways she'd never expected. The settlement wasn't just a place where love could flourish without fear. It was a place where justice could flourish alongside love, where children could learn to read without worrying that education would be seen as dangerous, where families could work together to build futures rather than just survive from day to day. "There's one more thing," Creek said, producing his own letter from the territorial capital. "Tom Brennan's been appointed as the new federal marshal for this district. He wants to know if we'd be willing to serve as consultants for investigations involving trafficking and corruption." Elena considered the offer carefully. Part of her wanted nothing more than to focus on building their community and raising the family they'd begun planning. But another part, the part that carried Miguel's determination and her mother's practical courage, understood that their work wasn't finished. As long as other families faced the dangers they'd survived, what would that involve? Helping identify signs of trafficking operations, training other investigators to recognize the patterns Miguel documented, maybe testifying in federal cases where our experience could help convict criminals who prey on desperate families. Elena looked around the courtroom where so many corrupt officials had been sentenced over the past 6 months, then out the window toward the settlement where children played safely while their parents built honest lives. The contrast represented everything Miguel had died to achieve. "We do it," she said. "But we do it from our home, with our community as our base. We help other families find safety, but we don't abandon the safety we've built." Creek smiled, recognizing the wisdom that had kept Elena alive through all their battles. She understood that serving justice and building happiness weren't contradictory goals. They were complementary aspects of the same larger purpose. That evening, as they rode back toward the settlement through desert landscape that no longer seemed hostile, Elena pulled Miguel's wooden cross from her pocket one final time. The crude carving had been her talisman through months of fear and fighting. But tonight it felt different, not a memorial to loss, but a symbol of victory earned through courage. "Thank you, Miguel," she whispered, holding the cross up to catch the last rays of sunset. "Thank you for believing that truth was worth more than life, and for trusting me to prove you were right." Creek reached over and squeezed her hand, understanding that some conversations were meant to be private, even when love was shared completely. His own father's cavalry saber hung in their home now, displayed alongside Miguel's cross as symbols of the courage that connected past sacrifice to present hope. As they reached the settlement, they could see families gathering for the evening meal, children who would grow up believing that justice was possible, parents who could work without fear that their success would make them targets, neighbors who protected each other, because they understood that everyone's safety depended on everyone else's freedom, Elena. And Creek had accomplished something that seemed impossible during those dark weeks when they'd been hunted across the desert by men who wore badges as licenses to kill. They'd proven that ordinary people could document extraordinary crimes, that truth had power even when spoken by the powerless, and that America could be different from the places people fled, not automatically, but through the courage of those who demanded that it live up to its promises. Miguel's journal, preserved now in the territorial archives, bore witness to one final truth he'd understood even as he lay dying in the desert heat. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't fighting for what's right, but trusting that others will fight alongside you when the moment of decision comes. That trust had been justified, justice had been served, and hope, like the desert wildflowers that bloomed after the spring rains, had taken root in places where it had seemed impossible to grow. In the settlement that bore Miguel's family name, love and justice flourished together under the same vast sky that had once seemed filled only with threats and sorrow. The boy who'd carved truth into pieces of wood had become a man whose courage echoed in every child's laughter, every family's security, and every promise that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Sometimes the most important victories are measured not in battles won, but in communities built, families protected, and children who grow up believing that courage and truth can overcome any corruption. Miguel Vasquez had been proven right about America, and about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when justice demands their best.